Good evening. Welcome to Ask the Lady Electrical Inspector podcast. I am your host, Tabatha L. Tonight, I will be sharing critical electrical standards and information on generator installation requirements for residential and commercial. I will provide insight into common reasons generators fail inspections. Stay tuned as I outline the necessary requirements for such installations. Generators offer a critical level of protection against electrical power loss when properly installed. Of utmost importance are the feeder conductor connections to the generator set. The connections from the generator to the transfer switch, from the emergency power source to the distribution system. Any compromises in these connections can cause safety risks and render your emergency power unreliable. What are emergency systems? Emergency systems consist of circuits and equipment intended to supply, distribute, and control electricity for illumination, power, or both. To require facilities when the normal electrical supply or systems are interrupted. Emergency systems will be identified by labels and use transfer equipment, such as automatic transfer switches, to switch from normal power to emergency power source. Its purpose isn't to provide power for normal business operations, but rather to provide lighting and controls essential for human life safety. Related articles for generators. Article 445, generators. Article 700, emergency systems. First, this is your first system, 10 seconds. Article 701, legally required standby systems. This is second priority. It has to provide power within 60 seconds or less after the power loss. Article 702, optional standby systems. That's the third priority after emergency and legally standby required systems. It's to protect for private facilities or properties where life safety doesn't depend on the performance of the system. These systems are not required for rescue operations. Emergency systems are legally required, often as a condition of operating permits for a given facility. Emergency systems provide power for emergency lighting, lighting, and exit signs upon loss of main power or in case of a fire. The purpose is to provide emergency power essential for human life safety egressing from the building and the structure. The goal is to keep the emergency system as reliable as possible. The emergency system must be able to supply all emergency loads simultaneously. The requirements, standards, and references to install a generator. You need a permit, is required. You need a generator load calculation sheet. You need a generator. We have a generator policy in my municipality. Also, we can provide you with the electrical ordinance. That also comes into play when you're installing a generator in certain municipalities. Seismic requirements, that's required. Also, for reference, you can look up UL 22 generator certification. So the first thing I mentioned was the permit. The permit is required. A permit is required. The type of permit depends on the municipality or the muni that is contracted. An electrical permit must be obtained to connect the generator to the house or the electrical system or any structure. These permits must be issued over the counter and the installer is on site. So also for that permit, you're going to need to include some crucial information. They're going to issue a permit number. You're going to need the generator KW. You're going to need premise number from the utility company. Depending on the size of the generator, it may take approximately 2 inspections, may be required. Normally, those 2 inspections are rough covers when we're checking the depth and checking the pipe, the conduits. So rough covers, that would be Article 300.15, a final inspection. So remember, the most important thing for the permit is don't forget your KW and don't forget your premise number that you need to get from the utility company. The second thing that I mentioned for the requirements, standards, and reference, generator load calculation sheet. The generator load calculation sheet, that comes from the authority having jurisdiction. That information will provide information. The generator, the emergency system must be able to supply all emergency systems simultaneously. That's what this code calculation sheet is. That's what it's really about. When the emergency supply also supplies power for non-emergency loads, the emergency loads take priority over the other loads. This is something that we require because in the last several years, we've seen generators installed for whole house generators as backups when the generator is not sized to back up the load it was intended to supply. So for homes, you would need a home generator load calculation sheet. That will give you information such as the total amount of calculated load for the home. That's what this is going to tell us. It's going to tell us if you require load shedding devices to load shed when you're doing a generator. So that's something that's crucial when you're doing a home generator. Make sure you fill out the load calculation sheet and leave it at the home, at the residence. Also, I mentioned that you are required, there is a generator policy. The authority having jurisdiction, we have of electrical inspection, sizing, operation, optional standby generator systems. So there's a policy, and I don't want to read the entire policy, but you can contact someone within the local municipality, and if the authority having jurisdiction does your inspections, this sheet will be provided to you. So that's something that you need to look into as well when you're doing generators. Make sure you know the local policies for that municipality, because every municipality has a policy. I have mentioned this several times because it's crucial. The electrical ordinance, 1102. You can find this information also. If you need it, just ask for it, but that's something that you need when you're doing generators as well, because there's requirements in there that you need to know as well. So with the 1102, things need to be listed and approved material and equipment. All material, equipment, and devices shall be listed and approved by the code official and shall be constructed and installed in accordance with the approval. Listings shall be by a nationally recognized testing laboratory capable of factory listing and field certification of non-listed material and equipment, and shall analyze electrical, mechanical, and workers' safety standards. So that's something else that needs to be looked into when you're installing a generator. Look into the ordinance, because that 1102 covers the listing of the generator, the entire generator assembly. And such things should be included in that listing, such as the manufacturer's name, the interrupting rating. The equipment must bear the listing, the marking suitable for use as service equipment. It will tell you the size of conductors. So those are some things that the listing information will provide for you. Also, I mentioned with those requirements for installing generators, seismic requirements. Seismic requirements are required. That's for both home and commercial. So that's a requirement. So remember, you can also get that information from your local jurisdiction. I mentioned this UL 2200 label, and it suggested that a significant amount of planning, testing, I'm citing this, I'm reading this, testing and independent review for safety have been conducted to provide the owner with a product that meets UL design standards. So this is just a label that certifies that if you get equipment with that label, they're certifying that everything has been checked and everything is okay with that generator. So I just wanted to give you some basics on that before I really got into some of the common things why generators fail inspections in my area. This is just my area. So a list of reasons why generators fail inspections. If it's a whole house generator, the generator becomes the first means of disconnect. What does that mean? That means that the panel inside the house is now the subpanel. So now the main water grounding electrode conductor that goes to the water shutoff valve in your house, that conductor has to terminate at the first means of disconnect if it's a whole house generator. So I often have that problem when they don't carry over the main grounding electrode to the first means of disconnect. I have that problem often. That's Article 250.24.4. Also, Article 225.21 requires a disconnect means for conductors that supply or passes through a building or a structure. So, as I mentioned, if you have a detached structure, you must have a disconnect at that detached structure. So if you have a generator, you need to have a disconnect located at that generator and at the supply on the other side when you entering the building at the closest location. This requirement means if you have an outdoor generator set, there must be a service disconnect where the conductors enter the building, and the disconnect must be suitable for use as service equipment. The NEC also requires each disconnecting mean that is installed and used as a service disconnecting mean to be identified as a service disconnecting mean. Where an outside house generator is equipped with readily accessible disconnecting means located within the site of the building. So that article for that disconnect, as I mentioned, you can find it in 225.31, also 700.1 701.12b6 are notes that I have here. 701.12b5, 702.11. The house panel. Okay, I mentioned the house panel. Now, if the generator is the first means of disconnect, if it's a whole house generator, the house panel becomes a sub-panel. The problem with that being the neutrals are not separated from the grounds. That's a real carrying issue because now that becomes a sub-panel in the house. So keep that in mind. Separate the grounds and neutrals. The transfer switch outside. A problem that I often have, if you're coming, depending on the location where you're coming into the transfer switch, the top or the side. The point is, if you're coming in over overhead protection, an overhead protection device. If you're coming in the top entry, the way the conductors are routed. But if you're coming in, you need a connector that is conducive for the weather. So you have to have a connector that's rated for that. So just keep that in mind because I often have that as well. You need a Myers hub or a weather-related fitting. And if you do use a PVC fitting, don't forget the ring, that yellow ring. I don't know what color it is in different locations, but there's an O-ring, what they call it, a washer. It's like that's for the seal tight. Often, if they do use PVC, they forget to put the ring. That's for sealing the box to make sure that you have it watertight integrity. So make sure not to toss that when you're installing your connector. A big problem I have on generators, probably once a week, PVC raceways from the feeder to the generator. You can't do that. That's a violation because it has to be flexible. All the connections to the generator must be able to absorb the vibration and the movements. So the generator set vibrates. So the connections between the generator, the building, the housing, the foundation, or any other structure must be flexible to absorb the vibration, the movement of the unit. And if not, they can fail, causing damage, breaking down for the generator, and the potential damage of personnel. Flexible cables and connections are required. So in this incident, what needs to happen when you transition from coming from your ground rough, from coming from your source of power, from going to your source of power in your a trench, normally what's used is PVC. So you need to transition from PVC to LFMC, liquid, tight, flexible metal conduit. It provides the flexibility. That's what you need. A listed trans fitting is also required. Just remember that, because a lot of times when you transition, when they know that they need to transition, what they forget to do is use a listed transition fitting. We call it in the trade a go-to. So they'll use something and they'll make the go-to, and then you remember you got this a rigid coupling that's not conducive for the weather outside. So all of that's not a listed fitting, but just keep that in mind. When you transition, you need flexibility and you need a listed transition fitting. Another thing that I often have issues with, undersized grounding electrodes for the water. Because if the generator, depending on the size of the generator, and if it's the first means of disconnect, that's what you're sizing it according to. Table 250 Here's a problem that I have. Now, remember, we were talking about that transition fitting at the generator coming from the ground. Now let's go from the generator going into the structure, the house or the building or the structure. Now you're transitioning out of the ground. You're coming in to maybe a plastic box or fitting or LB or some type of fitting to transition into the building to go to feed your loads. So that PVC raceway that's coming out of the ground, if it's not concrete, solid, coming out of gravel or dirt, you need an expansion fitting. That's the number one thing I hit on a weekly basis. You need an expansion fitting because you must compensate for the expansion of that, the thermal expansion and the contractions and where the link changes. So that's something that you need to look into and remember, keep that in your mind, that when you enter that building, you need a transition fitting when you enter that building. Even if you're coming into a box or a fitting, because that's been a question. Does it matter? It doesn't. It matters the point that it needs to, it has to compensate for thermal expansion and contraction. So that's the point of it. The generator. I've had this issue several times. The generator, obstruction clearance for utility meter. Table 110.26, working clearance. The generator cannot obstruct the electrical meter or any electrical equipment. You have to have the working clearance. So there's times where I'll come on a job and the pad is set, but the generator doesn't have proper working clearance for whatever reason. But just remember, that's required for generators as well. I mentioned the trench cover. That's when you're putting the PVC in the ground, the trench. That's an issue, the depth of the trench to bury the raceways. You can find that information in table 300.5, the minimum covered requirements. That's for 0 to 1,000. Keep that in mind as well. Sometimes the contractors forget the notification, the labels and the signage for the generators. That's a requirement because they will say, well, it's on the way, it wasn't ready. So remember that those have to be legible. They must be suitable for the conditions that are outside. So usually placards are made, but that requirement, you can find that in Article 700.7a. A sign shall be placed at the service entrance equipment, indicating and the type of location of each site emergency source. So just remember that don't forget the signage, because if I come on the inspection and it's a final inspection, before the inspection can pass, everything has to be complete. And that completion includes the signage. I can't pass it without the signage. It may be small, but they minimize it, but that's a big deal. Temporary generators for carnivals and art fairs and things like that. We have festivals, things like that. They have temporary generators. So the biggest issues, well, I'll just tell you I'll give you information about the temporary construction sites similar to the generators. Electrical permit must be taken out for a temporary generator for those type of fairs and things like that. If it's a fair and a generator must be used, you have to take out a permit. In the locations where the generators are likely to be exposed to physical damage, one must provide an enclosure, guards, or ballards. That's the big one with the cables. You have to barricade. If you have an electrical generator, you have cables going everywhere, and you have to make sure that it's excluded from the public. So you make sure, like, there's ramps that you can use, these heavy duty ramps that are used to put the cable, lay the cables in, and make sure that if a cart have to run over the cables, that they are protected. So I felt that those carnivals a lot because of the physical protection from the cables, and also the connection point for sorry. Thank you. The connection point for the ground rod. That connection must be mechanically tightened. A lot of those connections are loosened. That's the only source of grounding that you have on a temporary generator, would be the one that you drive into the ground. So that connection must be mechanically fastened. So make sure that you remember to check those, because normally if you have a fair that they do every year, they put the generators in the same location. And sometimes they leave the acorn on there, but just check to make sure when you're doing that connection that your connection is mechanically tight. And this is something worth mentioning. I've had this maybe twice, I think twice, I can recall. Refurbished generators. I won't speak too much on that. I would just say no, because I've been asked that question. The generator actually came on site. It was a refurbished generator, and had no certification, no paperwork, anything like that. So I don't want to speak too much on refurbished generators, but it's up to the local municipality or the authority having jurisdiction, and that's something you're going to have a hard time getting somebody to sign off on. So I'll say no to refurbished generators. So in summary, undersized generators are being sold. The contractors often are asking, where are you getting these requirements? So the authority having jurisdiction, they thought it would be a good idea to send something to the contractors to get ahead of this problem and perhaps eliminate some of the arguments that you all are probably having with the generators, because each job takes on a case-by-case basis. Because I've heard that being said, well, my buddy had the same type of generator, but I just want to put that out there as well, that each job is done by a case-by-case basis. So remember, as a reminder, the generators must be capable of supplying the load of the equipment that is expected to power. I also want to bring up one other issue that I had a few months ago, and I think this is worth mentioning because of the audience that I have. I wanted to bring this generator problem up because this generator was a 3-building generator enclosure for a local hospital, originally arrived on the job site, not listed. And the manufacturer, they tried to send out some labels and after the enclosure was on site. The manufacturer, by agreement with the nationally recognized test and laboratory listing agency, cannot install labels or have anyone install them on their behalf. A field evaluation to list and label was required for this piece of equipment. It was a major piece of equipment. So just remember, before your equipment leaves the factory, make sure it has the proper listings, because that's going to be looked at. So if you look at the NRTL guide information, that goes with the listing. All electrical wiring, devices, and equipment inside the enclosure that was not fill, install, are included as a part of a listing. So when they come out there, everything must be filled. It has to be listed before you get on the job site. So one of the major problems. So the problem with this job right here is that they needed a field evaluation, and that evaluation included all of the electrical items in that building, which includes heaters, AC units, lighting, panel boards, switchboards, generator, conduit, wiring methods. And that's really costly. So make sure that when you're ordering the generators that those labels are on there. The labels are on the generator for the listing and labeling. The issue with this particular system, they needed 2 egress. They had one door that egressed, but another door they had was a sliding door. The door was a sliding door. EC tells you that you must have a door that has panic hardware. That's specific. It tells you that. So that wasn't accepted by the authority having jurisdiction. That needed to be corrected. That was one of the major issues because that's a form of egressing and getting out of that space safely. So that was a big issue. I'm just bringing that up because it did happen in our municipality. So I wanted you to be aware that make sure you check the listings for the generators. That was the biggest issue for that job. So tune in next Wednesday, and I will give you a list for prefab manufactured buildings. I'll give you some information regarding prefab manufactured buildings. My goal is to be proactive in preventing future non-compliance issues before the inspection happens. If you have any questions, any comments, please contact me on any of my social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, under the moniker Ask the Lady Electrical Inspector. If you would like to add to anything to this discussion, please provide feedback to AskTheLadyElectricalInspector@gmail.com with any questions or electrical concerns. Thank you for tuning in, and good night.